Hello, hi everybody. Hello and welcome to the Brooklyn Rail's 1086th New Social Environment. I'm Madison, a programs associate here at the Rail, and I have the pleasure and privilege of being your MC today for a conversation featuring Centamore, James Hoff, and Jennie Waldow. And now I'll introduce today's guests and host. Alice Centamore is a PhD student in the Department of Art History at the University of Chicago. She is the editor of A Something Else Reader and our topic of discussion today, the Fluxus Newspaper, both published by Primary Information. Alice is currently researching independent feminist and lesbian communities in the 1970s and 80s North America. Her other projects include the republication of Monique Wittig's work in English and a book on Judith Arcana and the Chicago Janes. James Hoff is an artist living in New York City. He's the co-founder and executive editor at Primary Information, a nonprofit arts organization founded in 2006 to publish artist books and artist writings. Primary Information facilitates intergenerational dialogue through the simultaneous publication of new and archival books, providing a new audience for out-of-print works and historical context for contemporary artists. Jennie Waldow is a curatorial assistant and collection specialist at the Hammer Museum, Los Angeles, where she is the curator of the upcoming exhibition Out of the Ordinary. She received a PhD in art history from Stanford University with a dissertation focused on the work of the American artist Alan Ruppersberg. Her areas of interest include fluxus, ephemera, and works on paper. And I'll go ahead and pass the mic over to our host, Jennie. But before I do that, I just want to point out if any of you guys have questions during this discussion, we're going to have a link for you in our chat where you can follow that and submit your questions for the Q&A at the end for Alice, James, and Jennie to share with you. All right, Jennie, whenever you're ready.
Great, thank you so much. I'm really thrilled to be here with you, James and Alice. And just to start off, I was wondering if you could talk a little bit about the genesis of the Fluxus Newspaper project and where you see it sort of sitting with Primary Information's other facsimiles and archival publications.
I guess I can start with this one, Alice, that's okay. So yeah, I guess the newspaper, the Fluxus newspaper is a pretty natural project for Primary Information. Since 2007, we've published dozens and dozens and dozens of facsimile publications, and some of them have been Fluxus publications. One of our earliest facsimile publications was the Great Bear Pamphlet series, which was published by Something Else Press in the mid-60s. And this is something, the Fluxus newspaper, CCVTRE, has been on our list for pretty much since the beginning. When we started, we put together a list of books that we would like to see in the world, myself and Miriam Katzeff, co-founder. And many of them were facsimile publications, and many of them were publications that I came across while working at Printed Matter here in New York. And it was there that I sort of learned that facsimile publications, or at least publications that are archival in nature from the past, were sort of out of reach for a lot of artists and students and general audience, scholars, what have you. And that despite the fact that artist publications were originally meant to be democratic, multiples were meant to travel through the world and not cost very much money, a lot of publications from the 60s, 70s, 80s, and 90s, and now even beyond that, were far out of the price range for a lot of people. So the Fluxus newspaper is one of them that has been, because, I mean, due to the nature of how it's produced, it's something that is very rare and is hard to find. And if you can't find a complete set, it's probably going to be either in an archive or with a dealer on the secondary market who's going to charge thousands of dollars. So this was like, Fluxus newspaper is kind of a prime project for Primary Information in that regard. And it's a project that we've come back to on and off with the idea of considering it for publication since probably 2008, 2009, and kind of felt like the right time to do it, particularly after working with Alice on the Something Else reader. It seemed kind of like now was the time. So we started working on it, I guess about 1.5 years ago, 2 years ago, and kind of went from there. So came out earlier this year.
Great, thank you. I was wondering if you could both talk a little bit about your roles in the process.
Yeah, sure. So as James mentioned, I started working with the team at PI on a Something Else reader, which was an anthology of artists and authors published by Dick Higgins' publishing house, Something Else Press. And as we were working together on that publication, it somewhat came naturally to start discussing the Fluxus newspaper again. And since PI has been thinking for a long time of putting it out, it sort of came naturally. And so since many of the artists associated with Something Else Press also overlap with artists who were part of the Fluxus collective, like one really followed the other in a very natural and organic way. And I don't know, I feel that this was very much a collaboration. So we each put our own different expertise in the project. So we started from, like, in the case specifically of the Fluxus newspaper, we started with like where to find material, like where to find the original materials that could be used for the scans, to then discussing the challenges of republishing it and deciding which format it should come out as, what paper to use. And James can speak more eloquently about those details because he's so knowledgeable about this, since he's been doing it for so long. To then also discussing the project with, well, primarily the George Machunas estate, who's represented by Billy Hutchins, and then just discussing the project with all the members, or all the people who were published in the Fluxus newspaper, which are probably over 60 artists at this point, and bringing the project to them, and yeah, in a way, and also collecting stories that they shared with us as we were like putting this together.
I should add that there's a lot of challenges with doing a project like this. One is the first, obviously, is the easiest, and that's identifying if it needs to be back out in the world. And we sort of determine that by gauging the conversation that's happening around us and that's happening beyond us in either publications or exhibitions or other forms. And that's the easy part. The hard part is finding the original material, and then even harder is convincing people to allow us to use them to scan. It wasn't the case with the newspapers because they're not bound. Originally, they weren't bound, but in many cases we have to disassemble books and scan them in order to reproduce them. And that involves a different kind of consideration in terms of who we ask for a publication and or where we source it. So that's a few of the issues, and this is what we would consider a facsimile publication at Primary Information. So we do all the scanning, in which case the original publication was an old school tabloid. So roughly 20 inches by 30 inches, 22 inches by 32 inches. I don't remember the precise dimensions, but very big, too big for us to reproduce at a 1-to-1 scale. So we decided to scale this publication down to the sort of the maximum dimensions that are possible for us to distribute the book easily into the world. So our mission as a nonprofit is about getting the books into the hands of individuals. We sell all of our books at cost, and we have worldwide distribution. So we can't really easily ship a book that's like this big throughout the world. It'd be hard to even do in the States. So if we scale the book down, which we did in this case, that allows us to get the book into the world in a greater way. and for it to travel even further, which is, I think, very important. It's not easy to make those types of decisions. There's very few decisions that we have to make editorially when it comes to facsimiles. But this is one case in which we had to sort of make an executive decision to scale the book down, and also to not reproduce the newspapers as loose leaves. So we bound all the newspapers together, which also aids in its accessibility. It aids in its sort of capacity to be archival. Many people might know or may not know that newspapers aren't archival by nature. So we have to source a paper that is a newspaper. It's basically a newspaper or something that feels like a newspaper, but is archival. So it's not 40 years from now, it's still going to be available and hopefully not turning to dust. But one never knows what will happen in 40 years, but hopefully in this case, the publication will still be around. So those are some of the decisions we have to make. And then of course there's scanning, and we clean up all the publications as well so that they appear as they originally did. Like, we took out a lot of the dirt and a lot of the aging, or all the aging that happens. The key is to produce the work in a way that it can enter the world as originally intended by the authors, or in this case, the editors. So those are some of the decisions we have to make, and that Alice and I made together while producing the publication.
If I may add something, I feel that one of the other challenges with this publication specifically was that the newspapers were not necessarily intentionally made to last, and so the materials that we had access to were extremely fragile, and also somewhat difficult to scan. But this is also why I feel, even as like a scholar, it's so important that these facsimiles exist, because even when you do access them in the archives, sometimes the relationship that you have with this materials is it has to happen. Sometimes you're not allowed to manipulate them. Sometimes you have to wear gloves. Sometimes someone opens them for you. And like when these facsimiles are available, you have a more personal relationship with the materials, which for Fluxus, it was very important and somewhat fulfilled Maciunis's intention of engaging physically with the materials.
Thank you. Could you talk a little bit about sort of the lenders that you encountered, collectors? Alice, you mentioned meeting with some of the artists and hearing stories. If you could just talk a little bit about that process and some of the people that you encountered.
So specifically for this reissue, most of the, so I don't know, I know that very few collections, like institutional collections, have a full run of newspapers. The Silverman collection at MoMA, and then a couple of other museums. But we were lucky enough to find out that the Shigeko Kubota Foundation in Soho, they have an almost complete run. And so we borrowed most of the materials for them, from them for the scans. And then a few other friends of Primary Information who had the missing issues were kind enough to loan them to us for the work. And then I think that two figures that were very present as we were assembling this publication were Barbara Moore for James and Sarah Siegel for me. So Sarah Siegel she's the co-executor of the Bob Watts estate, but she was also very much integral and part of the Fluxus group starting in the 70s, and actually even probably late 60s. And so I was lucky enough to be in constant conversation with her as I was assembling this. And I should also say that Sarah Siegel was the designer and the production manager of the last two issues of the newspapers. So every time I had some sort of question, I would like go to her and she would come up with incredible stories about like putting it together or like showing it to Maciunis, or collaborating with Watts or Jeff Hendricks, who were respectively the two people who worked on newspaper 10, that being Robert Watts, and newspaper 11, Jeff Hendricks.
Yeah, I just wanted to sort of give a just like speak to Barbara for a second, because she was one of the original editors of Something Else Press, but also George Maciunis's press back in the 60s. She's been a pillar of Fluxus for a very, very long time, but often sort of is happy to be in the background. But she has been a real guide for primary information since the beginning. She's been a huge resource for us, and also a friend to the press who's given us advice over time as needed and has helped connect us to people as needed. And with all things Fluxus, she's one of the first people we typically go to. And I also wanted to mention Olivia Shao, who is also, she's a curator. She's working at the Drawing Center now, does a lot of independent projects as well. But I know her through my time at Print-A-Matter. She's a connoisseur of artist books and Fluxus as well. And she was able to give us a very important missing issue that we needed to scan. So I'm thankful to her for that. So.
Alice, could you tell us a little bit about the history of the newspaper? Who was on the Fluxus editorial council, sort of what the process was of creating the newspaper?
Sure. So the newspaper, the Fluxus newspaper, so let's address the Fluxus editorial council first. So you'll see on the masthead of most of the newspapers that the Fluxus editorial council is continuously quoted as the editor of the publication. So we don't know exactly who the members of that council were at all times. It is clear that Maciunas was responsible for design. George Maciunas was responsible for designing and probably sourcing many materials for at least the first 9 issues of newspaper. George Brecht was also a major force behind the publication, and in fact, the title V3 or VT, I always say V3, but it's VTRE, comes from another publication that he had worked on occasion of the Yam Festival, which was like a 6-month long celebration and series of events, and culminating in May 1963 with a lecture performance. And he released this magazine called VTRE, which was like a 1-page double-sided, it wasn't broadside size, it was more like an 8.5 by 11, and it contained entries from some of the Fluxus associated artists, as well as people who are not usually part of Fluxus, like Robert Morris and Claes Oldenburg. And once Maciunas found out about this publication, then he had the idea of starting a Fluxus newspaper, and he borrowed George Brecht's title VTRE, and then to differentiate it from the precursor publication, he added CC, which was a Fluxus reference to George Brecht. And then the first couple of issues are just CC VTRE, and then over time, the council started using this combination of letters in a playful way, embedding them in funny titles. So I don't know, there's like one newspaper that is called Fluxus CC Vaseline Street, and then there's another one, and they all play with like these combinations of letters. Then we know for sure that for the last 2 newspapers, Sarah Siegel worked on both of them as a graphic designer, and then the number 10 was done in honor of Maciunas on occasion of a feast for Maciunas that his artists and friends organized. And it was then in collaboration between Sarah Siegel and Robert Watts. And then the 11th and last newspaper, which is what you see here in the slides, that was done posthumously after Maciunas's premature death. And that was Jeff Hendricks and Sarah Siegel were the 2 main forces behind sourcing the contributions, and Sarah specifically doing the design. I hope I answered to the question, but I feel I'm missing a part of your question that I didn't address.
No, that's great.
Okay.
Thank you. I was wondering if we could talk a little bit about like what was in the newspapers. Also, there are advertisements. If we could go back to slide 4, there's like a catalog that's in there, and people could write in like a mail order catalog. There's documentation of past events. There's advertisements for future events. There are pieces. If you could talk about kind of how the newspapers functioned, and then also who received them.
Do you want to, shall I go, or do you? Okay, I'll go. And
I just wanted to interject one, just while we were talking about Brecht and the original publication that came out of the YAMFest. I just wanted to say that we made a very conscious decision not to publish that within this context, because we wanted to keep it very much focused on the sort of Fluxus newspaper. And I think some people questioned that decision and or wondered why we didn't include that original broadside by Brecht. But I think it was important. It's important for us to sort of keep things tight on an editorial capacity in this regard. And so we opted out of including that. So I just wanted to throw that in there just so folks know that it's not part of the publication, even though the publication itself was based on it. But yeah, so that's, I guess, I just wanted to throw that in there while we're discussing Brecht and his importance for the publication.
Yeah, absolutely. In terms of contents, the newspapers, well, we should also say that a lot of Fluxus works and Fluxus events or anything related to the group of artists associated with the collective was publicized or was found its material form through a publication in some way or another. So from the beginning, Fluxus published anthologies with, I mean, even before Fluxus came to be known as such, there were like their entire aesthetics relied on the form of the publication. And so, and as well as little objects that Machunas would call the flux boxes or the flux kits, depending, that Machunas would put together by sourcing ideas from the artist. Then he would like create a design and make this little objects. Both the anthologies and the objects were quite expensive to produce and also required immense amount of labor to make them, since everything was handmade. And so the newspaper was probably this like in-between publication that wasn't so expensive to make, that could be made easily, pretty easily, and could travel also easily. We don't know exactly how it traveled or where it traveled. And so it's good to have in mind that publications are like one of the staples aesthetics of the Fluxus collective. And then in terms of content, as you said, it served many different purposes. So it had works from the Fluxus artist, ranging from event scores, which are word-based instruction pieces, to drawings, to sketches. It archived and documented performances or events that had happened. So for example, in 1970, there's an issue entirely dedicated to a Yoko Ono and John Lennon event. The photos for that event were taken by Peter Moore, and the publication is basically a document of that event with a legend detailing who was in the photos. They also function as the newspapers somewhat function as like publicity for upcoming events and for the objects that George Machunas distributed in the Flux shop. I'm not exactly sure if it was helpful for the Flux shop to bring in any revenue, or how, again, like who saw this newspaper, who had access to it outside of the circle of connoisseurs and Fluxus artists. But it has this dual function of like archival material and also just like a humorous whimsical publication. It also has a lot of materials sourced from just sources that the artist had available, like newspapers or like comic strips. There are articles that describe pretty weird or funky events that are included.
I would add, and I would be curious to hear what you think on this, Alice, as well, is that while it is called a newspaper and it ostensibly plays with the conventions of a newspaper, both in form and content, it's doing so in the sort of playful way that Fluxus dealt with many media forms and other art forms. And in that way, it serves an informational purpose, but it's not always easy to get the information. So it's put together in a way that it can function like an artist's publication or an artist's book or an artist magazine. And I think that's one of the successes of the publication itself, was that it was able to convey the character of Fluxus, the humor of Fluxus, the stakes of Fluxus, the goals of Fluxus, all within a context that was immediately recognizable to people, even though it did a lot to undermine that context or extend that context, or to evolve that context or that information that was involved inside of it. And also is a great example of an early example of the artist's newspaper, which sort of took off, I would say, in the late 60s, mid to late 60s, in parallel with artist publications and other pop forms, but also then flourished in the 70s and beyond. So it's an early example of an artist newspaper, and I think that's like something that's really important to highlight.
Yeah, absolutely. And then another, speaking of sort of using the newspaper format, but also disrupting it at the same time, I think that something crucial in Fluxus, and it's great to have a facsimile of this, is that their relationship to the text always goes through the body. So it's not a publication that, I mean, it's really up to the reader, and a person can treat it as they please, but there's an invitation to like turn the pages, look at them upside down, really like feel the paper. Sometimes you have to sort of move around the publication or move the publication around in order to fully be able to read something or look at something. And this is also one of the, I think, incredible contribution of Fluxus and the design of George Maciunas at the time to create this direct link between the body of the reader and the printed text in a way that like pulled the person looking at the materials into the publication.
Sort of on that topic, could you talk a little bit about the graphic design of the newspapers? I think we have a very distinctive sensibility, as you mentioned. There were several graphic designers, and so how did that kind of evolve?
In terms of graphic design, I would say that 1 through 9, Maciunas did the design for everything, and it is in his like canonical style. But he did, he sourced contributions constantly, and then he occasionally like gave, like in the case of George Brecht, very often like he gave them the editorial possibility of like designing an entire page. Then something that did change in terms of more than design, it's like approach to the publication. I think that as the publication gained momentum, they started to make entire spreads that were meant to be either like publicity for upcoming events. And so in the Fluxus Codex, which is this sort of Bible of Fluxus that John Hendricks assembled to catalog the Silverman collection, he speaks about that like some of the newspapers were meant to be like ripped apart, and one of the pages was meant to be like as a poster announcing an upcoming event. And then once we get to issue 5 or 6, I believe, there are entire pages that are invite activation of some sort. They can be kept as they are, but you could also cut them up and actually start reading, performing, or executing the different instruction pieces that are written on the page. So every newspaper has a different, in a way, like could serve different functions if one wanted to. And then the last 2 issues are more homages to the work that Maciunas did for the Fluxus Collective over his entire life, pretty much.
Thank you. I was wondering if we could talk a bit more about that last issue. If we could go to slide 8. Yeah, so this is the tribute issue to Maciunas after his passing. And this issue struck me so much as sort of having like a unified narrative and really being kind of a capstone to the publication. And I was wondering if you could talk about it a little bit more, how it came together, some of the pieces that are in it.
Yes, well, as you see, the page opens, or like the issue opens with a photo collage of Maciunas as a pope or some sort of member of the clergy. I think that this is also on the it's a bit of a joke in Fluxus, because I've seen often in letters or in correspondence or just in like artist notes calling Maciunas like the chairman of Fluxus or the Pope of Fluxus. And so this is probably sort of a reference to that. And then as you can, like the articles, so the entire issue is like tributes, drawings, collages, thoughts that the people who knew Maciunas sent to Jeff Hendricks and Sarah Siegel in honor of him. And so this spread is like a good example of what the newspaper of that issue of newspaper contains. There are also like articles describing random deaths of people that have nothing to do with Maciunas. There's also, and this is like a very important historical element in it. There's an excerpt of a very important interview that George Maciunas did with artist Larry Miller in 1978, so right before his death, and he's published in one of the pages. And as you said, like this is probably one of the most coherent issues in which you can, there's like a strong editorial line carrying and bringing everything together.
Alice, may I ask a question? Do you have a idea as to why that's the case? Do you think it's because Maciunas wasn't actually involved with the editorial process? Or do you think it's maybe because of the desire to pay homage in a way that was maybe presenting information that was going to be more legible to the audience, or more of a through line or clear line as to the sort of focus of the issue? What do you think?
I think it's because it was meant to be it was a publication in honor of Maciunas. It's also, we didn't mention it before, but this is different in size than all the other newspapers. So this is slightly smaller. I won't try to give you the inches because I'll probably be wrong. But I want to say it's like bound to it. Maybe it's like saddle stitched. I can't remember. But so it's like the one that feels more like a publication than all the other newspapers, which are really like flimsy newspaper print.
And this one was also it's the largest one, so it's like 12 or 16 pages. So the others were typically 4 pages. It would just be like one piece of paper that you would unfold, basically. So this one actually had multiple pages, felt more like a newspaper or a publication.
And also, I mean, Maciunas died in May of 1978, and this was like almost a year later. So I think it was not that there was any schedule in the coming out of the newspaper. Like the first 6 came out in the first 6 months of 1964, and then the next one, it takes like 2 or 3 more years to make it. But I think that this one, and in the way that, from what I can gather from artists, from the correspondence between the editorial council and the people who submitted things, like the editorial council kept asking for submissions, and then as they came through, they would put them in the newspapers, whereas this is like the only one that I feel was done with like a specific purpose in mind, which was like, submit something that reminds you of Machunas, or that you is associated with your experience and relationship with him. And it was, yeah, it was really a tribute to all his work. There's also, there's like a credit line in this issue of the newspaper where like Machunas is credited for everything. And this is actually something I never noticed. And then I think I saw him in the audience. Colby Chamberlain just published a book on Fluxus and the sort of print and paperwork in Fluxus. And it's a pretty good book. And he also discusses this idea that like Machunas covered so many different roles for the Fluxus collective. And so by crediting him for everything in this specific issue was like a way to acknowledge all the different contributions that he offered, from like being the one who tried to bring the group together to like the one doing the publicity, the one who designed so much of the Fluxus objects.
So James, you mentioned earlier a bit about where the Fluxus newspaper fits in terms of other artist newspapers and sort of the underground press of the 60s and 70s. Could you talk a little bit more about kind of the legacy of this publication and its influence?
I can to an extent, though. I think we should highlight how rare the actual publication is. So I think that I would say that its influence is the influence of this is like a very minor sort of project within the influence of Fluxus overall, and you can't really take it out of that context. You know, with Fluxus, you sort of get everything. They covered such a wide terrain in terms of performance, in terms of publications, media forms, and other street works, all these other things. And this publication is just something that is just was not possible to see before we published it in any kind of cohesive or consistent way. So I'm not sure that I can really speak to its influence overall within the field outside of Fluxus and its influence on artist books and publications and underground press are huge, of course. And both with Machunas and with other members of the Fluxus community like Dick Higgins and Something Else Press and Allison Knowles and many others. So I can't really say for sure. Alice may have more insight into that, but I think that I think it's kind of hard to sort of place its influence, and I think we'll see what that influence is now that this publication has happened, and as people have more access over the coming years, where the newspaper gets placed within the sort of history of underground publishing from the 60s and 70s.
Yeah, I think that sort of historical work specifically for the Fluxus newspaper still needs to be done, because I mean, even with people who are, as we were working on the publication, even with people who are pretty knowledgeable about artist books and the history of like underground artist publishing, very few people had actually seen the newspapers because they're so rare. And when a collector has it, most times they don't have the full run, they only have a couple of issues. And also another thing that it's complicated with these kind of publications, especially on the newspaper format, is that we really don't know how much they circulated at the time. We don't really know what kind of distribution was in place, even with something like Fluxus, in which so many other things were a lot more organized in a way. Then like there are letters between Machunas and other Fluxus artists, especially based in Europe. And so Fluxus has had these different centers offshore, like in Eastern Europe and then in France. And so we know that Machunas was sending them publications, and occasionally, like he's like, especially to Thomas Schmidt, I recently read a letter that said, oh, I'm sending you 50 newspapers, but then we don't know what happened once they got to Germany, or once they got to Nice through Ben Vautier. And I don't know how many then artists, even of the generation, of the following generation, post Fluxus, would have seen this. So as James said, it'll be nice to see now that this is out, who responds to it, and yeah, what kind of historical work will be done around it.
I should add that we don't even know how many were produced per issue. So we don't even know the print size or the print run, the size of the print runs for each newspaper, or even if they were the same for each issue. So there's a lot of questions, and I don't know for sure if there was an intention to obfuscate sort of around the newspaper or around Fluxus in general, but there's so much playfulness even just with the title that I think it's hard for people to know how many there are, or if they have, some people might just, the Machunas Dies, the last issue, is the one that you see the most, like you see it reproduced, and it's the most iconic by far. So some people might not even understand that there were truly others. I know it says number 11 on it, but it says a lot of things. These papers say a lot of things that are misleading or not true. So a lot of people might think this is actually just a one-off, because it's the one you see around. Or they might think that there's 3 instead of 11, or et cetera, et cetera. So it's hard to, I think it's probably been hard for archivists and probably not scholars, but archivists, librarians, and others to actually sort of understand the complete project of the newspaper itself.
This is somewhat related, but James, I was wondering if you could talk a bit how this publication relates to Primary Information's mission and sort of who you see as like a potential audience.
Well, our mission is simply to publish, in terms of facsimile editions or archival publications, which would be sort of publications that are based on archival material but never existed in a kind of physical form or in a published form prior to our publication of them. Our mission with archival material and facsimile editions is to get them into the hands of students, artists, members of the general public, scholars. It's quite broad, but the idea is that there's conversations around these things, around these publications. So whether it's Fluxus or it's Avalanche Magazine or Black Art Notes or Godzilla, there's conversations that are happening in the public sphere, typically with students and artists who are the last people to actually have the money to afford these publications on the secondary market, which, frankly, if you were going to actually buy all of the Fluxus newspapers, it would probably cost a few $1,000s, and no one, if you even found them, and no one I know outside of collectors has the capacity to actually do that. So that's a problem that plagues the artist book medium and artist publishing from the 60s onward, even beyond, I mean, before that. So our mission is to basically take these publications, reproduce them to spec as much as possible, reproducing the paper, the feel, everything, cleaning them up and putting them back out into the world and selling them at cost. So all of our publications we sell at cost. The hope is that we can sort of bypass the secondary market and get these into the hands of younger people, or anyone really that wants to be a part of the conversation that scholars are having, or curators are having, or museums are having, or archivists are having. Often these are things that these publications are alluded to or discussed, but only certain people are allowed to be a part of that discussion. And part of our mission is to sort of level the playing field, if you will, and give as many people access to the primary materials as possible so they can join that discussion.
Just as a final question, before we open things up to audience questions, do both of you have a favorite issue or article that you'd like to spotlight?
Go.
I don't really have one, to be honest. I mean, to me, I'm just so happy. Also, like as someone who's interested in these histories and also does not have access to the originals typically, like I'm just happy to have the complete collection on my shelf and available for research and reading and laughs and entertainment as well. So I would say that just the whole enterprise as a whole, I would say would be my favorite.
Yeah. I think that my favorite thing about working on this republication projects is to get in touch with the artist and or the representative of their estates or their partners and like get their stories. And so for I think it's slide number 3, image number 3, there's a fashion drawing of like, I guess, a model or something. And so this drawing is quoted, is the credit for this is Ben Patterson. So when I reached out to his widow, Barbara Patterson, she was like, this is actually not a Ben Patterson piece. It was drawn by my mother, who was a fashion drawer at the time. And then it somehow made its way into the publication. And then another couple, and also one of the whimsical things about working on these publications that sometimes the artists do not have emails, and they only go through either like letters or you have to call them and like hope that they will respond. And so I have like connected with a couple of people who I'd only heard of and found out through this publication that they are in fact alive, and had like really great conversations just about their I don't know, their life and their and what they were doing at the time that are not really accessible in any other way.
I think it's also I just wanted to say that it's great just to see some of the photographs. I mean, these are photographs that there's a lot of really famous Fluxus photographs and there's a lot that circulate. But here we're looking at like I'm seeing a great image of Joe Jones, I've never seen outside of this publication, and I'm looking at a great image of Alison Knowles that I've never seen just on this one spread. And I think these little things that come through are really special and real treasures within the sort of history of Fluxus. Fluxus, as Colby can speak to, Colby Chamberlain, who wrote the book, and Alice can speak to, like actual scholars within this field, Fluxus generated so much material, tens of thousands of pieces of ephemera and other things. It's nice to have a place to look at some of this material that we've not seen before and have it all there at once. But then also, as Alice was speaking to, some of these appropriated images. And in that way, I think the newspaper, kind of like Tuli Kupferberg's Yeah magazine, it really feels like it predates like an 80s or late 70s zine aesthetic as well, in terms of its cut and paste quality and its employment of appropriation and its playfulness.
All right, thank you both so much. This was really incredibly informative. And I'll turn it over to Chloe and Madison for audience questions.
Hey guys, sorry, just getting my screen share off for everybody. Thank you so much, all 3 of you, for such a wonderful conversation so far. We are going to get started with some audience Q&A. And if you haven't gotten the opportunity yet to share your question, we're popping the link in the chat again, and you can just go ahead and put it in there, and we'll make sure either that you get to ask it yourself or we can ask it for you if you would prefer that. I selfishly kind of want to go first and ask a question. I'm really curious about how you guys feel that Fluxus newspaper fits into the tradition of collage, and I guess specifically collective collage. It's also getting my wheels turning about newspapers in general. Like, are all newspapers just collective collage? So I'd love to hear more of your thoughts on that.
Jenny, Alice, do you want to take this? Scholars in the
Okay,
room.
I have to, I mean, this is a very important question. It's also a very large one. I don't know, to say a couple things specific to Fluxus, going back to the publication I mentioned earlier, the codex that John Hendricks assembled, he does quote Dada and the Dada style as a sort of precursor for this Fluxus cut and paste aesthetics. Then to go back to what James said earlier, I mean, I feel every newspaper is a kind of collage. It's like words and images pasted on a matrix that is usually very fixed and doesn't allow for much openness. And what is so great from like a design standpoint here is that the whole matrix gets scrambled because there's no more, like, other than the borders of the broadside, there are no other parameters that limit what the publication can look like, how the words look in print, how someone can read it even. Like, it also opens up the possibility of like reading something in a different way that is not the standard like left to right chronological way of doing it. And then again, like, this could be then thought in relation to the history of artist newspapers that followed from like the late 60s onwards. And you know, there's so much work to do there, and I think that someone will do it at some point.
I'm sort of curious, and that this isn't something that we can probably talk about or even answer, but I'm kind of curious. I would be very curious to know like how those layout meetings went, or how those sessions went when they're actually laying it out. And if it was Machunas, if it was a group of people, whoever it was, like how that actually happened. It feels like it probably would have been a very fun party, or maybe would have involved a few headaches / disagreements. I don't know, but I feel like there's a lot of exuberance is the wrong word, but you can see the playfulness, and I would assume that there was that playfulness was a pretty good time in terms of how each issue came into being in terms of layout and design. Yeah, I think that's like, I would love to be a fly on the wall in whatever loft that was happening in the 60s and 70s.
Yeah, I think to be a Fluxus fly would be quite a privilege. Our next question is going to be from Fong.
Thank you so much. Thank you, James.
Thank you.
Jenny, it's terrific to hear in and out. I will definitely pay more attention in the weekend when I can listen to the whole thing. I'm so thrilled to have a fellow publisher such as James to undertake primary information to great height. It's just fantastic. And I'm regretful that I no longer have the first 3 issues of Fluxus magazine when Jonas gave it to me, because he have extra copy. In 2001, a lot of my 40% of the Rail archive were destroyed by Sandy. So I don't have them anymore, but I'm going to get the whole thing that you published now. I have one quick question before I go to another meeting, is that since they were such close friends, Jonas and George Machunas, and I wonder, since Film Culture magazine were created long before Fluxus. I mean, we're talking about maybe 1954, when film culture was created by one singular funder, the great friend of Jonas, Jerome Hill, who paid for all the costs, the production costs for longest time until he passed away. It's a fascinating story itself. And I wonder what kind of discussion they have, because film culture magazine is fairly straightforward. Whereas what Machunas is a work of art in itself. So I wonder if there any correspondence between the two of them. Was there any references that they can talk about? Because so much of time being consumed with their friendship. And I know that when I talked to David Ross, when he was the director of the Emerson Museum, who did the first show, John and Yoko Ono, I know George designed the poster and everything for them. I think this must have been in 1991. He was here not long ago for dinner. So you guys know anything about that correspondent, what they talk about? Because I know they were such a great friends, ultimately.
I think that opens up a larger discussion just into what the question, like what that brings to mind to me is Machunas as a designer versus Machunas as a Fluxus artist, designer, publisher, and what the differences were for George in that capacity, and to what extent. I don't know enough about Machunas in sort of pre-Fluxus era to know how much he was designing, or to what extent he took that role seriously, or that was actually a career for him. He ran a gallery as well. So I'm not quite sure, though I do recognize his mark on some of the film cultures that I have, that he was participating in as designer.
Yeah, that's right.
Yeah. I mean, Machunas was trained as a graphic designer and an architect, and he was working professionally, especially in the domain of graphic design. I personally have not looked closely at the friendship between Machunas and Mekas to know exactly how much. I'm sure that they were in conversation, and the Cinematheque that Mekas was running was temporarily housed in one of the Fluxus buildings that Machunas developed later. So there was definitely a constant exchange of ideas and friendship. I don't know specifically for the Fluxus newspapers in relation to film culture, but that's a really good question and something interesting to look into at some point.
Right. Well, Jenny, you have observation of that, or?
No, I don't know enough about sort of the, like Alice said, sort of the period before Fluxus for Machunas, but it's definitely a fascinating question.
You guys aware of the Illegal Living? That book came out maybe 8 years ago now, that was put out, which basically the beginning of Soho as we know it.
On 80 Worcester Street?
Yeah, exactly. That's another discussion altogether one day. But thank you, you guys. This is delightful. I can't wait to re-listen to the whole thing this weekend. But
may I ask you a question if you have a second?
sure.
What was how did Mikas talk about Fluxus and Machunas? What did he think of Fluxus?
With great warmth and admiration. I think he met George Machunas when George was barely 17 or 18, super early on, not because they came from Lithuanian nearby villages, but it's just because they were both radical at the very beginning of their early formation. Always great affection. And I think that Machunas able to do things where Jonas couldn't. Jonas is extremely shy as a human being. He could only be visible, make himself available when he needed to. He's really a poet, as you guys remember. So we're in the head as a publisher of Film Culture magazine, and then eventually Creation right after, as you pointed out, Alice, after Cinematheque, what turned into Anthology Film Archive is something else. But it was a mutual beneficial friendship with mutual respect for sure. He learned a lot from Machunas, you know, very daring. And Jonas have a hidden sense of humor, which I don't think Machuna will ever try to even conceal it. His sense of humor is pronounced. And I know that Alison No was talking to me once about how people were taking the manifesto so seriously, you know, and that displeased him profoundly. So that's why to put him in the same context, André Breton, is incorrect. Because Breton was very serious, being the Pope of surrealism. So I would see Machunas in a much different light, much more playful. And I remember clearly too, James, having this long late night conversation with Louise Bourgeois. It was 2, 3 in the morning. And she was indebted to Jonas because Jonas, Louise, and Joseph Cornell, they all share the same birthday, this December 24th, I think. So they used to celebrate their birthday together. So Cornell, long gone before I even was born, so obviously that would not be possible, but I did manage to come celebrate birthday with Louise and Jonas a few times. And Louise confessed that she's grateful to Jonas for having introduced her to the Fluxus circle. And very important because you remember Louis was married to a very famous, much more famous at the time, until his death, was Robert Goldwater, the professor who coined the term primitivism, first who did scholarly work on Gauguin and other artists. So she was called Mrs. Goldwater until Jonas introduced her to Machunas, and it gave her this sense of community, of freedom, a sense of liberation to experiment and be playful. And that playfulness and that permission to be embraced and supported by that community was hugely life-changing situation to Louise, you know? And that's when it alleviated her amazing gravity and anger against her father, which is legendary nowadays. So anyway, that's just a tiny testament to Machuna's genius, you know? But anyway, I gotta go to the meeting, you guys. But thank you so much. This is fantastic. Thank you, James. Keep up the good work. Thank you, Alice. Thank you, Jenny.
Thank you for sharing the
Thank you.
Thank you.
Hey, the next question comes from one of our audience members, GE. And GE asks, is the very fleeting, elusive, and ephemeral production of the paper an intentional confounding of our everyday existence, a way of furthering a mystic journey or awakening? So beautiful question, GE.
In terms of the original?
Yes. In terms of
It's hard to say. I think it would be hard to find any newspaper that was archival or non-ephemeral at that time. My guess is that the expediency of the newspaper form is probably what led the Fluxus crew to it, but I have no idea. Does Alice, Jenny, do you know?
Jenny, do you? I feel that.
Yeah, it's a very conceptual question, appropriately. I think, you know, I study like ephemera more generally, and I think what's so exciting about it is, you know, the things that sort of come to us were not meant to be preserved. And, you know, it's sort of one person's decision a lot of the time about whether something is destined for, you know, the recycling bin, or if it's very precious and it's meant to be kept. And so it's these sort of chains of decisions that allow, you know, artists now or researchers now to access this material. I was thinking a lot about this when Alice and James were talking about, you know, how very few copies of the newspaper, the original newspaper, are in existence, and how they're not, you know, accessible typically as like a full run. And so it's this like something that's so amazing about the current publication is that it really brings together this material and sort of brings those decisions together that, you talked about how there was one issue that was kind of elusive, and, when you found it, you were able to complete the set, and how it's sort of those decisions by individuals that are very subjective that enable us to access this material now. So I think there's something really beautiful about that, you don't always know what's going to be like sort of important historically, but it matters to, one person or a small group of people. And that's why we can access that material today.
It's also interesting, I think, to see when everything comes together, it brings up often, you can see consistencies between issues, you can see inconsistencies between issues. It can bring a different kind of understanding of the material as a whole when things are pulled together as a collection. It opens up different questions and often different sort of ideas around what the enterprise was. Not always, but I think that when we're talking about these original issues being loose and in the world, you could get one and maybe surmise what the others are going to be like, but it's not until you see them all as a collection that you can start to understand the enterprise as a whole. And I think that's where de-ephemerizing the material, I think, can gain a lot of importance.
Thank you, James and Jenny, for those answers. That was, I love the question too. Thank you so much, G. Next up, we have Ty. One moment.
Hey guys, sorry, we were playing a hot potato with the mic there for a second. First of all, thank you, James and Alice and Jenny, for this conversation. I was really looking forward to it, and it lived up. I wanted to ask about the process of the facsimile itself, because I think there's a lot of, something funny that comes up with facsimiles, especially facsimiles of this kind of work, of like 60s and on sort of experimental work, is that the artists themselves were really messing around with a lot of things and were huge proponents of doing that messing around. But then when you want to reproduce something, you have to be really sensitive to the material, and you can't really approach it with the same energy that they might have approached the work in the first place. And so I wanted to hear about the process of talking to the artists. I know, Alice, you talked about that and discovering like little lies that were tucked in things, and just the process of determining like scaling things down and all of these changes that seem sort of small when you're holding a book, but are actually really huge to you guys, I'm sure, and to the artists especially.
I can say, that kind of brings up an interesting point with primary information in general in terms of how we approach these things. And a lot of times we get questions as to whether or not we get permission from the artists involved. And I want to say that, yes, we do. And we always attempt to. It's not always possible for us to reach an artist or their state. Sometimes they just can't be found. Fluxus is, because we worked with so many Fluxus publications, that's a little bit different, and there was a Fluxus network. So I think in ArtWrite, there's a gossip section in ArtWrite in the 70s, and they talk about a Fluxus event, and they say something like, if you get one Fluxus member, you get all the Fluxus members. And it was sort of like a joke about everyone showing up to this one performance in 73 or something, because maybe a Charlemagne Palestine performance. And so it's been easier for us in dealing with Fluxus material to actually get permission and to locate artists or their estates. And when we do, I mean, these decisions about scaling and compiling the publication, these sort of decisions that we make that are very macro in relationship to the new publication, we always make sure that we always lead with that, like artists know up front. So there's no attempts to undermine the original intention or to derivate outside of original intentions. So we always want the artist to sign off on things. And luckily, we've never had any issues with artists saying no. But if we did, we would sort of tackle that on a case-by-case basis. And I can speak to what Alice was saying about anecdotes. I think as a publisher, there's a sort of whole secondary archive of anecdotes that one collects as one moves through these processes and moves through publications and publishes books. You learn a lot, and it's not necessarily in the history books. Sometimes it's people's recollection, so it may or may not be right, but it always adds color to the history. And there's a sort of informal knowledge that that permeates through the culture of what we do. And it's very much a pleasure and honor to actually be a part of those, on the receiving end of that kind of information.
Thank you.
Thank you. And we have another question from the audience, from Dor. What is the relevance of Fluxus now in academia and beyond?
I think that over the past few years, there has been a big resurgence of Fluxus in academia. Like a lot of younger scholars are writing about, like, I feel that in terms of like Fluxus reception, there was none for a very long time. And then there was probably in like the late 90s, early 2000s, there was like a big wave of Fluxus scholarship, and then there was a long silence. And then now, I think mainly because the materials are being, like, a lot of the problems with some of this publication-based ventures of different sorts, not just Fluxus, is that the problem of reception is that, are the materials available? Like, can people look at them? Can people experience them? And so now that more things are being shown in museums and sort of republications are accessible, then people can engage with them and write about them historically. I don't know, there are like so many different aspects of Fluxus that could be discussed in terms of like what is interesting today. That would be a very long conversation, but I don't know, maybe just also, which comes through the newspaper to me very prominently, is the sense of how to work collectively and how also to contend between being part of a collective and being an individual artist. And how do you make art in that context? What does it mean to make something if you're just thinking of your own, or what does it mean to make it in the context of a group? How does like friendship and input from other people matter and possibly change, affects, influences what you're thinking and doing, and how that all is tied together and comes through from a physical object like a newspaper or really anything.
Thank you so much. All of those questions have been so amazing. That's all we have from the audience today, and it's been so wonderful having Alice and Jennie and James here to discuss Fluxus and ephemerality and beyond. And so I'd like to conclude by thanking Alice Centamore, James Hoff, and Jennie Waldow. We'd also like to thank the Terra Foundation for American Art for sponsoring our NSE program and making these daily conversations possible, and for their support of our growing archive, which you can view on the Rail's YouTube channel. The Rail has been free and independent for 23 years, and a donation directly supports our writers, production staff, and operations. Support our work through the link in the chat, and join us tomorrow at 1 p.m. Eastern for a conversation about the campus with curator Timo Capella, artist Jesse Willenbring, Chiara Repetto, and Andrew Woolbright. And you can now turn on your microphone and say goodbye as you leave.
Thank you so much.
Thank you so, so much. That was such a lovely conversation.
Thanks, Alice.
Thank you.
James.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you, Alice.
Thank
Thank you, Jenny.
Thank you. Bye, everybody. Take care.
When you'll.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Bye.
Thank you.
Bye.